The problem is that our bodies disagree with the government. And the government usually wins as far as what we get in our knowledge, and our bodies therefore lose.
We want your soul, your house, your phone, your life, your cash, your house, your phone. We want your soul, your house, your phone, your life, your cash, your house, your phone.
With the report saying that a global drop in meat consumption is vital to avoid devastating consequences. The authors state a substantial reduction of impacts would only be possible with a substantial worldwide diet change away from animal products.
But certainly the thoughts of limiting the meat consumption should be taken seriously.
Supreme Master Ching Hai has similarly spoken on many occasions of the immense toll of meat and fish production on the planet, tirelessly urging for a global switch to plant-based fare, as in the following excerpt from an October 2009 video conference in Germany.
But even though our predicament is very grave, we do still have time if we act now. And the solution is still very simple. Well, you know it, right? It's the vegan diet. No animal products.
Check out my pyramid. It helped me eat the best foods for more energy. I noticed a big difference. Pass it on.
It's my pyramid. I learned a lot about how to keep my calories under control by cutting down on added sugar.
You understand, for example, that there are essential amino acids. That's proteins, certain ones that we have to get. There are essential fatty acids. This is taught in medical school, it's taught in dietetic school. There are essential minerals, there are essential trace minerals, there are essential vitamins. All these things are listed as essential. There is one food group for which the word essential does not exist in any of the textbooks because they're not essential. There is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate.
We often hear this phrase, nutrient-dense foods. I think the Weston A. Price Foundation was the first organization to use this phrase. Then the USDA started to using it, and when they say nutrient-dense, they mean vegetables. They say vegetables are nutrient-dense foods. So let's have a look here. This is apple, carrots, red meat, and liver. Here we have phosphorus. Phosphorus is the energy. It's your fuel for your cells, is phosphorus. A little bit in apple and carrots, way more in red meat, and much more in liver. Here's iron, a little tiny smidgen in apples and carrots, quite a bit in red meat, and look at liver. Zinc, hardly any in the plant foods, lots in red meat and liver. In fact, red meat actually has more zinc than liver. and then copper, B2, vitamin A. There's no vitamin A in plant foods, a little bit in red meat. Look at the liver. A little vitamin C in apples and carrots, but there's actually more vitamin C in liver. And the one I like to point out is B6 and B12, which B12 has fallen off. But liver is so rich in B6 and B12, much more than even red meat. And these are critical vitamins. That's why I say if you're on a budget, you can get more nutrition from eating liver once a week than from eating red meat with every meal. So it's a very important food to include in your diet.
You know, because when we look at the food guide pyramid, which is a complete joke, and I've talked about this, they mostly advocate, the bottom section is bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, 6 to 11 servings a day. That's what our government wants us to eat the most of. It's more accurate if you actually take the food guide pyramid and reverse it upside down. Basically, just do the exact opposite of what they tell you and you're gonna be healthy. This is where it gets confusing because you look at labels and you're like, you see this little American Heart Association on your oatmeal or something. And you're like, oh, sweet, you know, this is good for my heart. And they actually studied a similar product, say it was bread, one that had the label of American Heart Association stamped on there, one that didn't have the label. The ones with the label actually had more sugar. They were completely the same. And again, when you say whole grain is the biggest piece of crap I've ever heard, because a whole grain means that you start with a frickin' kernel and then you can pulverize it, do whatever the heck you want with it. As long as you started with it before the processing occurred, you can say it's whole grain.
The idea that fat and cholesterol cause heart disease comes from 1952 from the diet heart hypothesis. This hypothesis has been called the greatest scientific deception of this century, perhaps of any century. A hypothesis is not the truth. It's only an idea. It has to be proven. This hypothesis, since it was proposed, no other hypothesis in the world had so much research put into it. Billions have been spent all over the world to prove this hypothesis. Billions. And huge political and commercial machine has been built based on this hypothesis. To prove a hypothesis takes a long time. Science doesn't work fast. And while science was working on this hypothesis, the governments in the Western world have fully committed to it. The media touted a new breakthrough, that this is the truth. And all sorts of commercial companies jumped on the bandwagon. Pharmaceutical industry is making billions on this hypothesis. Food industry is making billions. Medical industry is making billions. Western governments are making billions. This hypothesis today we can 100% say has been proven wrong. The diet heart hypothesis is a big mistake. It has been proven wrong for the last 30 years. But because our political and commercial machine has committed to this hypothesis, they work very hard not to allow the population to know the truth, to know the real scientific truth that came out. As you already heard, 95%, maybe more, of studies in the Western world are funded by commercial companies. In English, we have a very good saying. You know, in Russia, we have another, which is very good. But it says that the one who pays the piper orders the tune, right? And what is a scientific study? They design it, they collect data, and then the data is analyzed. If any of you studied statistics, how to analyze data, you would know that there are many methods to analyze the data, depending on what result you want to get out of it. Pharmaceutical industry, food industry, and other industries which benefit from this employ an army of statisticians to do just that for them. So all of these studies, 95, almost 100% studies on this subject, we cannot trust. They're full of lies. However, the honest science has been working on it. There are honest scientists in every country around the world, and they have come up with the truth. So what did the honest science actually say? That dietary cholesterol and animal fats have nothing to do with heart disease. They do not cause heart disease. In fact, there is no connection.
Tony the Tiger.
What outfit from Tiger?
Sugar Frosted Flakes by Kellogg's out of Battle Creek.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of Sugar Frosted Flakes? Those big crisp flakes of corn with that secret toasted-in sugar frosting? They're great!
One group of rats was given rat chow. Second group of rats was given cornflakes. And the third group of rats was given the box that the cornflakes came in. So the rats that got the rat chow lived over a year. The rats that got the box lived longer than the rats that got the cornflakes. The last cornflake rat died the day the first box rat died. The box rats died of starvation. They just lay down and got listless and died. The rats that got the cornflakes became very agitated and ran around their cages and started to bite each other. And they had fits and seizures and they died of convulsions. So there's something very neurotoxic about the cornflakes. And when they did an autopsy, they found lesions. So this is like little cancers, basically, in the nerve cells of the intestine. We have as many nerve cells in our intestines as we do in our brain. There's a big link between the intestines and the brain. So there's something quite neurotoxic about the proteins when they're extruded. And it's sort of like pasteurizing milk. You warp and distort the proteins. Same thing happens when you extrude. And then there are many nutrients that they're in the plants, but they're much harder to absorb from the plants, starting with calcium. Now, in traditional diets, there were really only two sources of calcium. Either dairy foods, milk, cheese, and so forth, or bones. And cultures that did not have dairy foods made a point of eating bones. The Eskimos ate the fermented bones. They would take the bones of small animals like birds and grind them up and put them in their food. So it was either dairy foods or bones. They were not getting their calcium from vegetables. A lot of the calcium in vegetables is blocked by things like oxalic acid or phytic acid. B6, magnesium, iron, zinc, and copper, all very crucial nutrients. They are in plant foods, but they're often blocked. They're often difficult to absorb, particularly zinc. The quickest way to develop a zinc deficiency is just eat a vegan diet, because you cannot obtain adequate zinc from plant foods. And zinc is critical for not only for our brains, but for reproduction. Over 100 enzymes are dependent on zinc.
People who eat the most fat and the most cholesterol have the lowest incidence of disease, all disease. The higher your cholesterol level in your blood, the healthier you are altogether. That's what science has demonstrated conclusively. People with higher cholesterol live the longest and the healthiest lives. People who are in their 90s, 80s, and people who reach 100 usually have high blood cholesterol. And they eat eggs and bacon and butter for breakfast on a daily basis, these people, almost exclusively. Let's talk about low blood cholesterol. It increases risk of heart disease and stroke. That is a fact. If you have low blood cholesterol, you will have high risk of heart disease and strokes. That is an absolute fact. It is associated with cancer. People who have low blood cholesterol have it low for about 18 years before they're usually diagnosed with cancer. That is the number that's been given to us by science. It is associated with violence, aggression, and suicide. We'll talk more about the brain, but what you have to understand, the brain is a fatty organ. It's got a high fat content, the brain. About 40% of that fat is cholesterol. Your brain is made from cholesterol, 40% of it. The substance called myelin coats every nerve fiber and every nerve cell in your nervous system, in your brain, in your spine, in the peripheral nervous system. It's like an insulation around electric wires. You know that electricity, all electric wires have to be insulated? Our brain works on electricity. So that's the insulation. Myelin, more than 60% of it is cholesterol. The rest is saturated fat. That is what myelin is. So when you start reducing blood cholesterol levels, you're putting brain under grave danger. Because brain has cell regeneration processes going on all the time. Cells in the brain do die, and they get replaced by newly born cells. These processes are very active. And these new baby cells need building materials to be made from. They have to be made from cholesterol, saturated fats, proteins, glyconutrients, and some other things, but a large percent is fat and cholesterol. And if the blood cholesterol is low, the brain is not getting enough to maintain its structure and to function properly.
And the doctor has no therapies, not one, even investigative testing methods that aren't harmful. All of them harm. Yes. And one time I talked with the doctor about that, and he said, "Oh, well, we didn't take an oath when we took the Hippocratic oath. There was no Bible on, so we really didn't swear to anything."
Well,
that was the attitude.
Yeah.
Think about what you're dealing with doctors. And doctors all are run by the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry writes all the medical procedures.
So the real cause of heart disease epidemic is sugar, bread, breakfast cereals, pasta. That's what they eat, day in and day out, and they think it's all right. That is the cause of cancer, autoimmune disease, of mental illness, of heart disease, atherosclerosis, diabetes, and every other disease in the Western world, in the modern world. Because they cause a glucose overload in the body. Human body has not been designed to get such huge amounts of one particular molecule. If you eat carbohydrates in a natural state, the way Mother Nature gave them to us, raw fruit, raw vegetables, raw grains, they're very difficult to digest. In fact, they're indigestible for the human digestive system. And most carbohydrate that's in them is indigestible. It goes through us, it doesn't absorb, doesn't digest, finishes up in your bowel, where the microbes in your bowel work on it. They digest it, and they manufacture, they convert all those carbohydrates, more than 75–80% of them, into short-chain fatty acids, which are fully saturated fat. So when we eat natural plants in a natural state, we digest them as saturated fat. They absorb, they feed our immune system, they feed our brain, they support us between meals. But generally speaking, high up, plants are indigestible. But what our industry does, it makes them very, very, very digestible by processing them. Flour is a highly processed carbohydrate. You finish up with high level of insulin in your blood all the time. That is what our doctors should be testing, not cholesterol. When they take your sample of blood, they should test insulin in your bloodstream and C-reactive protein for the marker of inflammation, to see if you have got systemic inflammation in the body. Overproduction of insulin leads to insulin resistance in the body. That is diabetes. That's basically another name for diabetes. Too much insulin leads to permanent inflammation, and perpetual inflammation is the cause of atherosclerosis and heart disease and cancer and everything else. People with low blood cholesterol have aggressive personalities and poor self-control. Carl Pfeiffer, a renowned American doctor who did research in American prisons, has discovered that more than 80% of violent offenders, people who committed murder and other violent crimes, had low blood cholesterol. More than 85%. Low blood cholesterol makes the brain starve, the brain cannot function well, the person becomes angry, these people are easily irritated, they easily attack, they easily become aggressive, and they are prone to violence and crime. It is associated with Parkinson's disease. Indeed, now we know that statins cause Parkinson's disease. We have an epidemic of Parkinson's disease. It's growing very rapidly. Without doubt, large percent of that epidemic is due to anti-cholesterol pills that people are taking. Because the brain is a fatty organ, it requires cholesterol. And if it doesn't get enough, it will manifest symptoms. It is associated with memory loss. In fact, memory loss is the #1 side effect of statin drugs. The brain cannot function, you can't remember anything. Because in order to form memories in the brain, synapses have to be formed. The cells in the brain have long arms. They grow long arms to communicate with each other. And when the two arms of two cells come together, they have to do this. They have to create a synapse here and a synapse here, and they have to connect. Now, the synapses are almost exclusively made out of cholesterol and saturated fat. If your blood cholesterol is low, that is the only place your brain can get cholesterol from. It can manufacture some, but not enough. Then the brain can't form these synapses. So the cells cannot connect with each other. As a result, the person cannot create memories. And it is the short-term memory that suffers. The person might remember what happened in the childhood, because those synapses were formed in the childhood, but he doesn't remember what he had for breakfast, and where he put his car keys, or where he left his hat, or his shoes, or something else. The short-term memory is not being formed, because the brain doesn't have enough building materials, resources, to create memories. These people can't learn anything new, because in order to learn something, we have to remember it. We can't form memory.
Every diet contained animal foods. This was Dr. Price's greatest disappointment. He had hoped to find a culture where they were only eating plant foods and that was healthy. And he did not find this, and he admitted that he was wrong. They went to great risk to obtain the animal foods, great effort and risk to obtain the animal foods. And all of the sacred foods were animal foods. In Dr. Price's opinion, the most important animal food was fish and shellfish. He not only described living skull structure, but he always took calipers with him, and he asked the primitive people to show him the skulls of their ancestors, and he measured the thickness of the skulls. And the people who ate the most fish and shellfish had the thickest skulls. Many cultures ate birds, chickens, ducks, geese, wild birds, always with the organs, fat, and skin. They didn't want skinless chicken breasts, that was, which is basically inedible anyway. And then a lot of cultures ate red meat, beef, goat, sheep, game, etc., with the organ meats and the fat preferred. In fact, they would hunt animals when they knew that they were fat because they wanted that fat. In Australia, the Aboriginal people, if they killed a kangaroo that didn't have enough fat on it, that was called rubbish. And they would just throw it away. It was not worth eating. Many cultures had dairy products from cows, sheep, goats, camels, water buffalo, reindeer, all different species. Always raw or cultured, never pasteurized. And many cultures ate eggs from birds that are outside. And reptiles and insects, again, very important foods, not for us, but for other cultures. I'm not here to tell you have to eat insects, but we have to recognize that these were nutrient-dense foods in many cultures.
In some cells, depending the function of the cell in the body, depending on where this cell is in the body, some of them have 70% cholesterol in their cell membrane, some have 30. So there's a range between 30 and 70% of cholesterol in the cell membranes in the body. Every cell, about 70% of every cell are membranes. So you can do the calculations yourself. What percent of your body is actually cholesterol and saturated fat? It is more than 50%. You are made from cholesterol. It is a structural element of every cell in your body. And you are made from saturated fats. This is a structural element. And because the cells in the body constantly die and get replaced by newly born cells, building materials are required to build those new baby cells from, to give birth to them. So our bodies require large amounts of cholesterol all the time for that process, and saturated fats as well.
The cats began to fight among one another. And everything he found, like I said before, this is just Pottinger looking at cats. Everything he found was exactly the same as what we see today with human health, because we are eating in ways that are not similar to what our body would most closely desire. So we've got all sorts of emotional problems today. They didn't have them before. They weren't there. They just didn't exist. If only we could teach our traditionally trained psychiatrists that one of the most important things for them to do is change their patients' diets. But of course, you don't want to do something that gets rid of patients. The idea is you get to see them over and over and over again. My entire goal is to see people so that then they don't need me anymore. Doctors don't seem to understand that that should be their goal. There's something that's usually said as a joke. It's not a joke, it was true, but it was true thousands of years ago, that in China, the doctor only was paid while the people remained healthy. Because as soon as the person wasn't healthy anymore, it meant the doctor hadn't done his job correctly, and he no longer got any money. Well, it would be nice if we did that today. Of course, if we did that today, doctors would not be an occupation people would want, because they'd all be in poverty, because none of them would get paid, because the patients aren't getting healthy. We're just suppressing their symptoms and bringing up additional side effects.
The last 12 FDA heads were all either on the a CEO on a pharmaceutical company or a chemical company, Dow, Monsanto, one of those, or they went to that position after they got out of office.
No, so they're pushing for a whole different agenda here.
Oh yes, there's
the
their
chemicalization
agenda,
of humanity.
Yeah. To me, what is happening is they want to make a lot of money. They want to keep control of people. So how do you keep control of people? You keep them procreating, keep them in credit, and you keep them unhealthy. Okay? They'll always be in fear of something because they're not going to be well. They're not going to be stable mentally or emotionally. So if they can't get foods that help them calm and relax and be at peace, they're going to be running to a doctor, especially with commercials that are all over, lying, deceitful, completely fraudulent commercials that the government completely ordains.
Here's a riddle. What do good girl singer Carrie Underwood and Anne Hathaway, Mike Tyson, Natalie Portman, Russell Simmons, Betty White, Russell Brand, Lea Michele, and Ellen have in common? Yeah, they're all vegan. Former Vice President Al Gore, yep, Gore's gone vegan. Al Gore, considered perhaps the biggest crusader against global warming ever since his movie An Inconvenient Truth. Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates now funding businesses that are developing alternatives to meat, mayo, and eggs. Former President Bill Clinton has adopted a plant-based diet.
I asked the top scientists on this several times, do we really have to get down to near zero? The temperature will continue to rise. First, we've got population. Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
The problem is that our bodies disagree with the government. And the government usually wins as far as what we get in our knowledge, and our bodies therefore lose. So they came up with a couple of other amino acids that they decided were conditionally essential, like maybe you might need them. Your body still disagrees with the government. So the end result is, where in our area of foodstuffs that we can consume can we get pretty much a decent complement of all of the amino acids that are out there? And the result, when they take a look at all that, is it's only in animal proteins. There are no vegetable proteins that can manage to do that. Now, the soy industry, of course, will tell you that soy is a complete protein. And that's because just those particular amino acids that they list as essential are all there. The quantities could be way too low for a couple of them, but they're all there. So they can call it a complete protein. Then the vegetarians will again say, well, you can make complete proteins with your meal by mixing a grain and a bean or a legume. Because the one that's missing, so you won't have enough, cysteine in one, you'll have it in the other. Again, we're only trying to get the ones that have been listed as essential. There are lots of others your body needs, and it probably can't make them all. So if you really want a complement of all of them, that's animal proteins again. So we need to do that in order to get all the various ones which are necessary for rebuilding of tissues. So complete must be from animal source, and in the eyes of your body, not in the eyes of our government. What we call complete and what your body calls complete are often different.
A lot of people who've taken my book, We Want to Live,
Yes.
and the recipe for living without disease, and given them to farmers. And once the farmers read that, he said, oh my God, milk will do this, my butter will do that. And then all of a sudden they take a stand against the government. They realize the government is harming the people.
Yes.
And intentionally getting rid of the good foods.
We have an epidemic of Alzheimer's disease. Western governments are in absolute panic because it is a terrible epidemic and it's like an avalanche coming onto humanity. Alzheimer's disease, dementia. Vast percent of that epidemic is due to statins because every one of these people are taking these drugs. The brain is starving. It cannot form synapses. As a result, the person cannot learn anything, cannot remember anything, and develops Alzheimer's disease. It is associated with poor immunity because our immune cells are high-fat cells. Large percent of the cell membrane and the membranes inside the cell, which form organelles, are made out of cholesterol and saturated fat. And immune cells live a very short life, only a few days, many of them. And when there is any infection in the body, there's a fight going on, many of them die. So your bone marrow has to work very hard to give birth to new baby cells, immune cells, because all your immune cells are born in the bone marrow. Bone marrow is a high cholesterol organ. It has a very high composition of cholesterol. And again, most of that cholesterol comes to your bone marrow from the blood. If you have a low level of cholesterol in your blood, your bone marrow is starving. It cannot manufacture immune cells, blood cells, and many other cells. As a result, you become prone to infections. Western governments are all running around with these hospital infections, MRSA. You've heard of that, haven't you? That hospital infections have become a big problem. Why? Because every patient in these hospitals older than 40 is on statins. They have reduced their cholesterol level in the blood. They are unable to fight infections. In order to fight an infection, we need LDL cholesterol. That is a major, major part of any fight with any infection in the blood. Your immune system requires large amounts of LDL cholesterol. And what are they doing? They're giving them statins. LDL cholesterol is low. The person cannot fight any infection. They're completely defenseless, these patients. That is why we have hospital infections. That is a major, major cause.
Approximately 1 out of 100 human beings carry a gene called 7-dehydrocholesterol reductase. In Eastern Europe, it's 1 out of 30. These humans cannot produce enough or any cholesterol. This leads to growth and mental retardation, autism, deformed bodies, violence and suicide. Humans only have animal cells. All animal cells are made out of cholesterol. Millions of humans would become retarded within months and die within years on a vegan diet because it does not provide cholesterol. Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome is when somebody has 2 of these genes. A vegan diet means automatic death for them. Vegans don't talk or warn people about this and all of the other deficiencies because veganism is a religion. They do not care about your health. Vegan blood tests have proven that they are deficient in cholesterol, which is why they are obsessed with violence and torture. Vitamin A is an animal vitamin. It will never be found in plants. Vegans will tell you that humans are able to convert pigments of plants into this vitamin. That is a lie. Infants cannot do it at all. Some children can do it poorly at best. Studies have proven that around 50% of healthy men and women cannot do it at all. Most humans are not healthy though, especially vegans. You will also not be able to convert if you have Not to mention the millions of humans who cannot eat any of these plants because of food allergies. This means that 70 to 80% of human beings are not able to do it, but it gets worse. The 20 to 30% who are able to can only convert 3%. Why doesn't every vegan learn about this before joining the religion? Simply because the last thing they care about is human health. They cannibalize themselves, use up their liver stores, and slowly but surely degenerate, depending on how much they have saved up. In nature, humans focus on eating animal fat. We never had to deal with this conversion, unlike animals that eat plants. We have the same digestive tract as other carnivores, so we will never be able to do this because nature won't change. You will only find vitamin A in saturated animal fat and organs. Why does the government tell you to avoid those exact things? Watch my documentary The NWO Diet to learn why. The gallbladder stores bile from the liver. Bile acids are used to help with the digestion of animal fat in the small intestine, meaning that we were specifically designed to eat saturated animal fat. This is how we get the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, F, and K2. Many animals that eat plants all day long don't require it because they continuously produce bile in the liver, such as elephants, camels, deer, and horses. Cows, goats, and sheep are an exception. A cow's diet is 80% saturated animal fat. They release the bile in the small intestine after the fermentation of plants. As we have learned, all animals eat a ketogenic diet by digesting the plants into saturated fat, so all of us need bile. Carnivores such as cats, wolves, bears, and humans, who may go long periods without eating, require the gallbladder so that they can release the bile when necessary. The gallbladder and bile are 100% proof that we need a diet high in meat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. By doing what your government tells you, you are going against nature. Ironically, for vegans, gallbladder and kidney stones are mainly caused by anti-nutrients and cooked plant oils, but also salt and other food additives.
Learning disabilities in children and adults, without doubt. Mother's breast milk is very rich in cholesterol. It has a high content of cholesterol. More than that, it has an enzyme in it to make sure that the baby's digestive system absorbs 100% of that cholesterol. Not one molecule of it gets wasted when babies are breastfeeding. Why? Because the baby's brain and eyes and bone marrow and other high-fat organs require large amounts of cholesterol to form themselves properly. Manufacturers of formula feed for babies know this fact. But because of all the propaganda with cholesterol, they don't put any cholesterol in formulas. That is why it is a very high rate amongst formula-fed babies. They have a very high percentage of poor ability to learn, lower intelligence, problems with behavior, and glasses. They have poor eyesight because their eyes didn't form properly in these children. And infections as well, because bone marrow is not being properly formed. It is associated with early death. People with low blood cholesterol don't live long. They die early.
I was living on a bicycle outdoors, which is very stressful. You know, the temperature changes from day to night. But living in that as a fruitarian, strict fruitarian, no lacto, no ovo, no meats at all, I disintegrated heavily. So I chose to die.
Because now the cancer's back and it's like, what
Right.
am I? I've tried everything.
I was aching in every joint.
Yeah.
If the temperature dropped below 50 degrees, I mean, at 50 degrees, I started having severe joint pain.
Mm-hmm.
By the time at 48, I was crippled in excruciating pain. I couldn't move.
So you were going to die, so you chose your way.
I chose
your
to
place.
fast to death.
To fast to death.
I picked an old Indian burial ground in California. I bicycled all the way from, well, I couldn't bicycle much anymore, but I was in Alaska at the time living with the Eskimos. And all the Indian tribes, I'd lived with 4 Indian tribes, and all of them suggested I eat raw meat.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, no, they're just trying to kill the white boy. Revenge, you know, because again, I'd been brainwashed into believing, even though raw foods were good, with the vagotomy, which is the severing of the vagus nerve and no hydrochloric acid in the stomach, I would die, I would get a parasite and die.
So this was heavily entrenched in your mind that if you ate raw meat, you were going to die.
Correct.
Of
yes.
poisoning.
Exactly.
But you tell us this next part of the story.
I was in this old Indian burial ground outside, you know, at the foothills of a mountain range, St. Martinez mountain range in Thermal, California. And I was just drinking water to keep the headaches away and was going to fast myself to death. I knew it would take probably 40, 60 days to do. So right away, I happened to pick a vein of the mountain where it led up into a canyon where a bunch of coyotes lived. Their den was up there. So they'd come down every night, wake me up, almost like clockwork at midnight, and do their howling and play games with me. By about the 10th or 12th day, back, you know, my mind's a little fuzzy from all the fasting from that period, but I was able to sense them going around where my campsite was down the wash. So the day that I sensed all 11 of them, the next night they killed a jackrabbit and offered it to me, ripped it up and put it at my feet. And, you know, I was also a philosophical vegetarian because I loved animals.
Yeah, that's
Didn't want
as
to
me
kill
for
the
20
animals
years.
as well,
I
being
understand.
afraid of raw meat.
Yes.
So what went through my head at that moment, though, you know, the coyotes were offering it to me, and, you know, I'm looking at the Easter Bunny. They ripped it open for me. It was all warm and squishy and everything at my feet. So this dialogue went through my head when I was probably about 10 years old. My brothers and cousins were going rabbit hunting. And my uncle was telling them that if they shot a wild rabbit, they needed to cook it till it was brown inside. There could be no pink meat at all, because there's a microbe in wild rabbits that will take over your intestinal tract within 48 hours, and you'll die a miserable, painful death within 48 hours. So, well, the pain would come within 24 hours, dead in 48. So I thought, oh, the coyotes are trying to help me die quickly. So I picked up the rabbit and I started eating. Of course, it came back up, and I had to psych myself in, like at the dinner table when I was forced to eat vegetables that would make me projectile vomit. You know, I forced myself into that mental attitude and ate the rabbit. And by the time I got through probably the 12th or 15th bite, it tasted incredibly good to me. So I devoured almost 3 pounds, 3.5 pounds.
Wow.
Coyotes shared the rest. They went away. I went back to my campsite to die, and I knew I was dying because I felt good.
Right, like
First
you were having that lucid moment before death.
Right, you know,
Yeah.
I had 3 near-death experiences, twice on an operating table, where they had to revive me, and on a recreational drug experience, and I had to be revived. So I had left the body at those times, and when you leave the body like that, there's no pain. You have to leave the pain with the body. So I was having that kind of experience, though I was walking in the body back to my campsite. So I knew I was dying, and I woke the next morning, and I'm still alive in my sleeping bag. I didn't go through any white tunnel or meet Buddha or Jesus or anybody. I was just still here in my body, and I had pretty good energy for the next 3 days, 4 days, and I didn't die, and nothing bad happened. So I said, Indians weren't lying to me at all. They were telling me raw meat. So I started, you know, hunting, trapping chipmunks and birds and scorpions and tarantulas. I ate anything I get a hold of. I'd just break off the poison gland.
Seal provides nourishment for the family and the dogs who will pull the heavy loads. And when the family is hungry, a stop is made to eat. Seal meat is eaten raw. The word Eskimo comes from an Indian language. It means eater of raw meat.
Dr. Price went to Alaska, out into the hinterland, where he could study the Eskimos living on their traditional diet. And here he found a very high degree of physical excellence. He called them splendid specimens. He loved that phrase, splendid specimens. Beautiful straight teeth. He described this woman's teeth as literally 2 rows of pearls, very broad faces, The children were sturdy and strong. They were curious and alert. He talked to a doctor who'd lived for 30 years among the Eskimos, and this doctor told him that among those who lived on their native diet, he never saw a case of cancer, heart disease, any tuberculosis, anything requiring an operation. So when the Eskimos or any of these primitive groups killed an animal, the first thing they did was eat the fatty organs, the brain, the tongue, the liver, and the marrow. They had a way of tapping that femur bone and bringing out the marrow, and they ate it raw. The marrow is 90% fat.
But for you to trap these animals and to eat them, this is primitive.
Raw.
This is raw. This is frightening, even though rare meat is just about raw. It's barely even warmed. The psychological difference that frightens people so and creates a lot of controversy around you is, what is it that's happening there as an intuitive being in our psyche that we cannot handle?
Well, it's our conditioning. We're taught to be afraid of everything, and it's the most absurd thing in the world. Look, I mean, we've had raw dishes throughout history. Steak tartare.
Yeah, the French are
Just
eating
chopped raw beef
Yeah.
and raw egg
Right.
mixed together. And the Germans eat more than anybody else of steak tartare, even the French. And we have carpaccio, which is thinly sliced, completely raw meat. Well, after, you know, a week of trapping little things and eating them, there's just not much food. And I was 96 pounds. So I got on my bicycle, went to all the near local farms, and I was in a farming country. So I was drinking a gallon of raw milk a day, eating anywhere from a stick to 2 sticks of butter a day, which is a quarter to a half a pound of butter a day, and chicken and eggs and everything I could eat. And within 2.5 months, I gained 50 pounds.
Wow.
And I looked like a scaled Arnold Schwarzenegger. The first time in my life that I had muscles. Before I was fat as a child, then I got very skinny once I became a diabetic.
And this was a combination of eating all the raw fats, the raw proteins, but also you were doing some labor at the time.
Yes.
So you were using your body.
Correct, which wasn't normal except for bicycling. Yeah, I went back to Los Angeles, spread the word that raw meat was the answer, and everybody said, oh, you're going to get a brain fluke and you're going to be an idiot. But this was the only thing that made me truly feel stable and well in my body, so I wasn't going to stop. And after 13 years of eating raw meat and 10 years of fear, I said, there's something terribly wrong here. I've got a vagotomy. I'm supposed to be deathly ill from eating anything raw, and here I'm eating raw meat for 13 years and I've never gotten diarrhea or vomit from it, ever. You know, this doesn't make sense. So I went to the main medical universities looking for the experiments that prove the raw meat gives parasites, and there wasn't one.
Yeah, we hear
It was all a myth.
salmonella, bacterial poisoning, where everyone's afraid of raw eggs, raw milk. Oh, you're going to get sick and die. The stats are something quite different. I mean, most of the salmonella poisoning that takes place is from cooked foods. Like
Absolutely.
what, 95, 96%?
99.999%.
Is all from cooked food.
Oh. Yeah, just realize that 99% of what the medical profession, pharmaceutical houses say is a lie. Do just the opposite, exactly the opposite, and you will be right.